everybody, it's Cash. What you're about to see are the transition pictures for William Shakespeare, but with bonus material at the end, because many people have asked me, do you think other playwrights, other artists wrote his work? And because I was able to go into the pictures for these other people, Francis Bacon, Edward Devere, I thought it would be interesting to link those pictures to this video of William Shakespeare's transition. So that's what you're about to see. First of all, the transition pictures, and then excerpts from other videos in which I explored whether other people might have written Shakespeare's works. Enjoy. Many people over the past couple of years have asked me to do transition pictures for William Shakespeare. He died in 1616 at the age of 52. And of course, I mean, who doesn't know about William Shakespeare? He's the most successful and famous playwright in the world. He wrote Othello, and Macbeth was the only one I saw of his, actually. But Romeo and Juliet, Much Ado About Nothing, and so on and so on. 39 plays in all, plus a whole bunch of sonnets and poems. There are people who are Shakespeare deniers. They're called anti-Stratfordians, Stratford-upon-Avon being the place that Shakespeare was born. And they say he didn't write the plays, it was Christopher Marlowe, or it was Francis Bacon, or other people. Well, I guess we'll never know, because so much of Shakespeare's life is really unmapped out. We don't know what happened. We know that he was married. He got married at 18, and he had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son called Hamnet, who died at the age of 11. And basically, Shakespeare was not too much of a deal in his day. People recognized that he had talent, but it was about 200 years before people said, wow, that Shakespeare guy, he's quite something, right? And only then did he become revered as the greatest playwright of all time. But so much is still unknown about his life, including how he died. Although there are apparently contemporaneous notes that say that he went out on a bender with a couple of other writers and got so drunk that he caught a fever and died of the fever. Interestingly, he left a will about a month before he died, and the will said that he was in perfect health. So something happened, and it could be a fever, and that caused him to die. But I thought I would go into his energy and see what happened after Shakespeare went on this bender. And it's interesting because when I found him, he was already halfway down a cliff on a ledge. And he sort of leaned out. I don't know if he thought he was invincible, or if he didn't really much care about his life, or he liked taking risks. But he leaned out and lost his footing and dropped. It was as simple as that. It reminded me of Corey Monteith, you know, the guy from Glee, the actor from Glee. It reminded me of his pictures. He went along a tunnel, taking drugs, drinking alcohol, and thought, I wonder how far I can go before it's too late. And by the time he found out, it was too late. He was already dead. This was the same thing for Shakespeare. And he fell. But on the way down, he fell on something like a girder. It was like bam and off, suggesting that there was pain. This wasn't just a matter of, oh no, I'm fading. He hit something on the way down. My father did that. And that suggests he had some kind of heart attack at the very last minute, and that's what saw him off. Same with Shakespeare. When he fell, and he landed in that cave I always see, that metaphorical cave. And when he did, he was completely dazed. But more than that, for the very first time, I saw somebody here whose consciousness was in a fog, in a fuzz. If he was feeling really, really bad because of alcohol or something else he did to himself, then yeah, maybe the drink and the fever that resulted caused his consciousness to be completely muddled because he couldn't see anything. He was just really under the weather, not physically, but on the inside too. He was really depleted. The interesting thing came when he went up the symbolic tunnel I always see that leads to the light. because inside this tunnel, the ground was black. It was tarry. He had to wade through a stream of something gloomy and grim. I don't even know what it would be. I'm calling it tar, but it could be anything. But it felt like he had a whole bunch of stuff on his mind, on his conscience even. Or maybe he had a terrible childhood full of unhappiness. You don't get to be that astute a writer, that wise a writer, unless you have been through stuff. And it would seem that Shakespeare had gone through stuff. Maybe he was a prodigy who was bullied. Maybe he struggled so hard, or his parents weren't kind to him, or something. I think his mother was the daughter of a rich landowner, and his father made drapery, or something like that. But whatever it wasn't a happy childhood, or his circumstances were grim, because this tunnel was so awful, like wading through an effluent drain. So much so that when he got to the end, finally, having slipped and slithered around, he was coated in whatever this stuff was, this ego stuff, this residue of a life of anxiety or pain, trouble of some kind. And he stood before the light feeling unworthy. Don't forget, he wasn't big in his day. There may have been a tremendous amount of insecurity here. And he compensated for that with drinking or whatever. But he was covered in this ego stuff, and it was dripping off him. He was leaving a big black pool on the floor. Whatever had happened to him, whatever tumultuous events had led to him being a brilliant playwright, but also a damaged human being, grace accepted him for that. It was a series of lessons. It may very well be that the plays were incidental to the lessons he had to learn in life. He lived not to write those plays, although that's what he did. He also lived to learn these other lessons about himself and about his soul and his journey. He was so full of trepidation and so encumbered by things he'd said, things he'd done in his mortal life, that he was concerned about the reception he'd get. And yet it's warm, it's magnetic. You feel drawn to commune with it, to let your spirit go into the greater whole. And reluctantly, he stepped into the light and shed all the tarry murk that was coating him. And he went. But this just throws up so many mysteries. What did he go through in life that honed his perceptions and his talents and gifts, that enabled him to make wonderful art, to write sonnets and poems and stuff, and yet left him so wounded emotionally? We will never know. But it was dark in there. His gifts came from a very dark place. And that's why his work has endured for as long as it has. Now, if you remember, last time I did transition pictures for William Shakespeare. If you didn't see that, I will put a link to the video in the show notes below this one. But several of you wrote and said, yeah, interesting transition pictures, but did he really write his own plays? I mentioned that there were several pretenders to the throne here, and one of them was a guy called Edmund Devere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. There he is. What a guy. He had such a tormented, turgid life. He was married. And he had mistresses, and he had kids in wedlock and out of wedlock. He was even accused of raping small boys at one point. He was an expert jouster. He went around the world entering jousting competitions. He was a patron of the arts. And because he wrote poetry and plays himself, although they weren't very good and they were lost somewhere, people said, well, maybe he wrote Shakespeare's plays. And there was this conspiracy theory going round. And somebody said, will you please look at the two of them and see what happens? So I did. I put William Shakespeare alongside Edmund Devere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. There they are. And when I did, there was immediately a very interesting dynamic between them. I saw a table, and Edmund Devere said to Shakespeare, please, sitteth, let us talk. And so they sit down at this table, and it seemed to me that Shakespeare was offering a plan, or he was trying to get money and support, or there was some kind of negotiation going on. And Edmund Devere said something like, yeah, I can help you. I know these guys. And he pointed to some people who were over there. You should join up with them. They will be your champions. They will be your sponsors or whatever. And so Shakespeare goes over. These guys are elated that William Shakespeare is even talking to them. And they hoisted him above their heads, jubilant. At which point I think Edmund de Vere's connection to Shakespeare was done. He had nothing more to offer. And there was a ramp in the background, and away he went and off over here somewhere, leaving Shakespeare in the company of whoever these people were. So I don't think that Edmund de Vere even had time to write Shakespeare's plays. He wrote 39 plays and a bunch of sonnets and stuff. I don't think he had time to do that. His life was too tumultuous. But what he may have done is he may have been a go-between for Shakespeare in his efforts to fund something or get support for one of his plays. He found his angels, his backers, and these people were just overjoyed to be involved with the William Shakespeare. So no, I don't think Edmund de Vere wrote Shakespeare's plays. Many people wrote and said, have you considered Sir Francis Bacon? Sir Francis Bacon was the Lord Chancellor of England at one point, a very important lawyer and scientist. He also came up with a way of categorizing library books according to subject. Whoever would have thought of that? Apparently he pioneered that idea. But he was a brilliant man, and he went to Trinity College, Cambridge at the age of 12. Many people have said quite clearly he was so educated and so brilliant and a patron of literature and stuff that he probably wrote Shakespeare's plays. So I put William Shakespeare next to Francis Bacon to see what the energy was like between them. And Francis Bacon was wearing a cape. Behind him, kneeling on the ground, was William Shakespeare holding one of those things that plasterers or bricklayers use to mix their cement kind of thing. They go put it on the bricks and then mix it again and put it on the bricks. He had one of those, only without the cement on it. And as I watched, he held this flat thing under the back of Francis Bacon's cape and something dropped out onto it. Then another thing, until William Shakespeare had a heap of this stuff on his flat bricklayer's thing. Once he had enough, he parted it, he dipped into it looking for something and pulled out a little ingot, little solid thing, which he put on the ground. Then he went through the process again, back to the cape, more stuff came out, and foraged around again, produced another one of these ingots, put it on the ground, until he had a whole line of these ingots, but they all came from Francis Bacon. I wonder whether Shakespeare, who was known to have collaborators, he didn't do it all alone, whether he was inspired by Francis Bacon, whether Francis Bacon discussed things with him, whether this was a collaborative affair all round, involving Edward de Vere as well in some capacity, as I revealed in the last video. If you didn't see that, I'll put the link down below. But I wonder if it was all a community effort. Shakespeare did the grunt work, perhaps, Francis Bacon supplied ideas. Edward Devere organized people to produce the plays. I don't know, but it seemed to be that a lot of very valuable stuff came from Francis Bacon. And without these ingots, Shakespeare couldn't get enough material together to write his plays.